Hey everybody, Countdown VHS here, and welcome back to another Wayne Riders update / lore video. It has been a while since we've had an update for the mod, but work is progressing, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what that work involves, and also talk a bit about some lore-related stuff. So in terms of the work for the mod, we have Weba84 working on the units. We've got the unit rosters, I think 100% complete for all of the factions. In terms of their units, they are all fleshed out. The thing that had been holding us up for a while is all of the various levy / assimilation style units, whatever you want to call them, units that you would have access to once you start conquering beyond your homelands. And because the team put a tremendous amount of thought, discussion, debate, argument probably into all of these decisions, it took us a while to flesh out just what every faction would get if it conquered every province on the map, right? So we didn't want this to be just a kind of cookie cutter thing where you got your faction's units everywhere you conquered. It's the current year. You have to have a more involved, a more complex recruitment system than that. And of course, Fourth Age Total War, which this mod is very largely, based by in certain ways, or based upon, does use a fairly complex system. And the one for Wayne Riders is, I think it's fair to say, going to be even more complex, or maybe larger, simply because in using the Alexander EXE, we have just more options available, more units available. So that has been a lot of work, and Weba has been doing great keeping at it and just sort of plugging away at all these region-friendly variants for different factions. So if you're playing Angmar, for example, like the camera is centered right now on Karn Doom, the capital for the faction of Angmar, you're going to get different units if you conquer different places, right? We're not gonna show them today. I don't want to get you too excited here, but we are. I did want to signal that work is continuing, and I also wanted to talk a bit about maybe some specific Northern Middle-earth related stuff. So Angmar is centered in part because I wanted to talk about the Hillmen. The Hillmen of Rhudaur. Now, this is something that I may have touched on in a couple of other videos, but it's something that I've been thinking a bit about lately and putting my thoughts together in writing. Maybe it's something that I'm going to have as a Substack in a little while with a more fleshed out set of thoughts. But basically, one of the interesting things about how Wayne Riders is presenting the factions to me is that it allows us to dig into some very, underexpressed areas of the lore. These are areas that Tolkien left hints, but he did not really elaborate, and so very few people have picked up on these. A lot of the big mods for Middle-earth related stuff, I think it's fair to say, draw from the movies, and so some of the more subtle references to things that you can only find like in the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, or even in scraps of work that never even made it into those published copies, like in Unfinished Tales or in Peoples of Middle-earth, let's say. A lot of those little references don't get through, perhaps. I don't know. I haven't played all the Middle-earth / Lord of the Rings mods. But we do take pride, I think, in picking away at the lore and picking out some subtle elements. One of the things that you can expect to find if you're playing as Angmar is the presence of Hillmen. And these are going to be referred to in various ways depending on which unit you are seeing. But Angmar is an interesting faction. In the appendices, it's not quite clear exactly what proportion of men to orcs to trolls to other beasts actually comprise this realm, this kingdom, right? The witch realm of Angmar. There is a mention of all of those types. We do hear of evil men being drawn to the Witch King's banner. We also hear of orcs. I believe trolls are mentioned at one point. So there's a lot of variety, I guess you could say, and we have captured that variety in Wayne Riders. But one particular element always stood out to me, and that is the Hillmen of Rhudaur. They are called Hillmen. They are never called the Hillmen of Rhudaur, but I call them that because it seems fitting, because they are found in Rhudaur, right? These are people who eventually will throw up a chieftain who will take over rule in Rhudaur in around the probably around the year 1350 or so. So for some historical context, we know that Angmar rises around the year 1300 in the Third Age. It takes a while to coalesce, and the first real sort of blow is struck in some ways by Rhudaur primarily, which has been in secret league with Angmar, suggesting to me that Angmar is initially somewhat precarious. It does not want to reveal its hand too soon. And so we hear of this evil lord of the Hillmen who has seized power in Rhudaur. And we hear that this force, this new Hillmen-led kingdom of Rhudaur clashes in, I believe it's the year 1356, along the Weather Hills, and kills a king of Arthedain. This is a significant moment. To me, this represents the peak of what I might call a Hillmen dynasty. Right? This is a very short-lived phenomenon, but it does seem to be the case that for maybe 50 years or so, we have a non-Dunedainic power ruling a Dunedainic kingdom. And this is, I think, incredibly interesting and significant and unparalleled, in fact. We don't see anything like this anywhere else in Middle-earth. If you think of the three kingdoms of Arnor, or Arnor, and then when it splits into Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur, Rhudaur is the only one that has rule from a non-Dunedainic leader, but still retains its initial structure, right? It still retains its structure as Rhudaur, as a kingdom, for a while, right? For that brief 50-year period, and we'll get to the end of that in a moment. Cardolan remains in the hands of Dunedain leaders until it is just destroyed by Angmar, hundreds of years in the future. Arthedain, of course, holds on until it too is destroyed. Essentially, its dynasty forced into exile. These become the chieftains of Arthedain, the remnant of the Dunedain that eventually yields Aragorn II. Other places that were held by Dunedain kingdoms include the sort of the fringe areas of Gondor. So you've got Calenardhon, which is gifted to Eorl the Young in, what would that be, 2500-ish, is that right? Of the Third Age. That, too, is a very significant moment, and you can tell by the way power is so ostentatiously handed over between Cirion and Eorl. There's that fascinating essay, or I guess, historical record, or whatever you want to call it, that you can find in Unfinished Tales, called Cirion and Eorl, that describes the incredible ceremony and solemnity that is associated with the handing over of this part of what had been Gondor to a chieftain of the Northmen. This, however, is not, I would argue, the same as Rhudaur being led by a chieftain of the Hillmen, because in Calenardhon becoming Rohan, we have really the founding of a new kingdom, a new nation come to settle on formerly Gondorian lands. This is not the handing over of a prior existing power structure. You could argue in some cynical way that Cirion was merely reinforcing and reflecting in law with all due ceremony a process that was occurring anyway, right? You've got the Northmen coming down. Gondor is simply not able to hold Calenardhon at that time. It had been essentially lost by, to the Balcoth, and even before they had come, we know that Calenardhon was very poorly settled, very low population. And so when Eorl comes with his, many
Aorlings around him, all the horses and all of the men and the women and children and everything else. We are told, straitened in their lands in the north alongside the river Anduin, and so they are ready to settle this land in a way that Gondor simply isn't. And so I would argue that that is not the same, despite all of its ceremony, despite all the dignity that is given, right? Cirion and Eorl go up to the tomb of Elendil, right? And they make this solemn oath. And it is, it is a very impressive moment, but it is not the same as an outside power seizing control of the entire reins of a kingdom, right? This is essentially, Calenardhon, when it's handed over to Eorl, is essentially an abandoned territory. Gondor is simply saying, you can have it, right? Maybe the closest we have can be seen in, a much later conflict when Wulf, son of Freka, attempts to take over power, and he does succeed, actually, for about a winter. He rules in Meduseld. This, again, is at another layer of a remove, but there, at least what we have there is an outsider seizing control of a kingdom which Gondor didn't rule as a kingdom, but at least allowed to exist, right? So we could understand that by, 2758, the Long Winter, by that time, Rohan was viewed as a kingdom that was in a, we don't want to call it a client relationship with Gondor, but maybe to some extent it was, right? There was certainly great respect between both of the peoples. There's certainly that level of respect is stressed in the chronicles that we can see in Appendix A and Appendix B. But nevertheless, there's a clear imbalance of power between the two, right? And so it seems that when Wulf takes over, he's doing kind of like what this nameless Hillman chieftain does in Rhudaur. But again, the difference is that Rhudaur had been previously held by Dunedain, and it remained a Dunedain power structure. It remained a Dunedainic kingdom, only ruled by a Hillman. Other examples, we might look further south. We might look to Harondor to see where a Dunedainic realm or part of one, right, had been established. The region between the Poros and the Harnan rivers had been ruled by Gondor for quite some time, and then it is lost to Gondor. The difference there is we don't know exactly what that looked like. We don't know if there was one group that took over control in Harondor, or, as seems more likely to me, there were many groups and many areas of essentially desolate land. And of course, it depends to some extent what period of time you're looking at. If you're looking at Harondor, before the Corsair-Gondor wars, it's going to look very different than Harondor, after those wars. But regardless, I don't think we have anything comparable in Middle-earth history to what we see in this brief moment in the 14th century of the Third Age, when a middleman, right, this Hillman is not in any way, as far as we know, connected with the Dunedain. He seizes power in a Dunedainic kingdom and holds it for about 50 years. Now, the chieftain himself, the evil lord of the Hillman, I don't believe we know his fate or when he died. We do know that he was presumably already in power by the time the battle was underway in 1356, and he was able to some extent organize his men, organize this alliance with Angmar. And if you sense that I'm maybe giving him a bit more agency than he deserves, after all, the leader of Angmar is the Witch King, maybe you're right? Maybe I'm overestimating this Hillman leader. Nevertheless, it is interesting that we see Rhudaur as essentially the instigator of that war, that battle in 1356. What changes about 50 years later, however, is that in all of the subsequent conflicts, we don't hear of Rhudaur again, and we are told that Rhudaur becomes effectively just absorbed into Angmar. And I think we can detect a rather sinister sort of takeover, that the Witch King had secretly supported this evil lord of the Hillmen in his bid for power. We don't know exactly how he supported him. Of course, the details are practically non-existent. This is only mentioned in a few sentences in Appendix A, and you can get a few other hints about how things have progressed in Appendix B. But in that 50-year period, we hear eventually Angmar itself comes out and declares open war, but they don't attack Arthedain or Arnor directly from the north. They go down through Rhudaur, cross the bridge, and then go over into the west towards the Weather Hills and Weathertop. I think that battle occurs in 1409. The progress of that march, I think, is significant, because if you look at the geography here, there's really no reason for it. There's no reason that if you wanted to attack the power centers of Arthedain, and let me just get the fog of war off here, that if, you know, that there's no geographical reason why the Witch King couldn't have marched from Carn Dûm straight down to Fornost, right? Especially if he controlled all of this area. And I think, another reason why we could say that with some confidence is because later, about 100 years from the point in which this mod begins, Arvedui, the last king of Arthedain, meets the snowmen of Lossoth, right? Like the Icemen, whatever we call them here. And they have very well-developed senses of fear about the Witch King. My sort of reading of that moment is that the Witch King, in assembling his power around 1300, has been drawing from pretty much everybody nearby. This would include Hillmen, presumably living somewhere around here, the native population who were related to the Dunlendings, right, the men of the mountains, that is the White Mountains far to the south, who we are told did advance far into the north. This is sort of the native indigenous population of Middle-earth, if you will. Of course, it's been, over the millennia changed, and additions have been made from various quarters. But regardless, we also have this population of the Lossoth. And we could also read in, some of the hints of that account, also in Appendix A, that the Lossoth mentioned their enemies. It says that they dwelt for the most part inaccessible to their enemies north of this great cape. Who are their enemies? Well, presumably other Lossoth, and those other Lossoth may well be in the service of the Witch King. That's sort of my thinking here. We hear that Angmar has been gathering it to itself men and orcs and, other beasts and all those types of things. And so some of them could certainly have been the Lossoth. And so essentially Angmar has influence, if not outright control over, all of this area, all the way down here. And then certainly after 1409, direct rule over Rhudaur. So why would they not simply attack directly down to Fornost, as we hear them doing much later in around... I think it's 1974, 1975, when that last war for Arthedain occurs. Why don't they simply march down from Carn Dûm? And I think it's because they need to assert control over Rhudaur. They need to end this puppet government, essentially, which has been ruled by Hillmen for about 50 years, and take it over directly under those loyal to the Witch King. We see Angmar, it's interesting because it seems like such a sinister, threatening place, but it's in existence for about 600 years or so, and in that time it takes a very long time for it to get anywhere. So we see its first tentative outgrowths are diplomatic. The interesting thing about that, to me, is that it shows that these Hillmen, this Hillman lord in particular, is, capable of being diplomatic. We might tend to see these guys as cavemen or something, but there is some political acumen there. And the reason I think that we can also detect some political acumen on the part of these Hillmen in their brief dynasty is we do know that there were Dunedain living in Rhudaur until the very end, until Rhudaur was finally absorbed into Angmar. There's a line in the appendices about the last Dunedain and Rhudaur leaving at this time, and that suggests that for the 50 years or so during which Hillmen ruled Rhudaur, there were Dunedain in Rhudaur who were happy enough to follow these Hillmen leaders. That to me is, if that interpretation is correct, it's kind of astonishing. Again, how different is this from Wolf's brief rule in Meduseld, right? That lasted only a season, and presumably, everyone was miserable about it. We don't get the sense that he was very popular at all. But here in the north, we've got Dunedain from a very, a senior branch of the family, so to speak, the Elendil side, happy to follow under the leadership of this Hillmen leader. And of course, Dunedain fought Dunedain in Arnor for a long time, even without the instigation of Angmar, evidently. So perhaps this shouldn't be too surprising that the Dunedain of Rhudaur, always sort of wishing that they could hold Amon Sul and the Weather Hills, always sort of thinking of themselves perhaps as the junior partner, at best, in this three-way division of power. They got the raw end of the deal. I mean, just look at the geography here of Rhudaur, and imagine yourself as one of these Dunedain. You've got what is essentially the absolute worst third of Arnor, and it's not even a full third of it, like in terms of just raw geographical area. Arthedain has all of this fertile land. It's got what would become the Shire, of course. Cardolan, too, has a tremendous area with a lot of coastland all the way down here into Minhiriath, and no doubt also including the settlement of Tharbad. And that means that Cardolan, to some extent, commands this great trade route with Gondor, because until relatively late, Gondor maintained these roads in Enedwaith, which we've represented here in the mod with this very well-developed road, as well as these couple of forts, because we imagined that, in the days, up until the days of the Plague, we're told that these great causeways, these great roads, led right to Tharbad. And it wasn't that this area was ever heavily settled by people from Gondor, but it was considered, at least nominally, sort of under the rule or the protection of the South Kingdom. So Tharbad would have been a fantastic jewel in the crown of Cardolan or whoever held it, and Rhudaur never had a chance. Look at also the sort of the neighbors that each of these kingdoms has. So Cardolan would, of course, had a very long border with Arthedain, largely peaceful, but even at times when peace was not an option, you had this relatively defensible river. We've got a ford here. We know that Sarn Ford did exist, and so that presumably means this was the best crossing over the Brandywine. You've also got another population in these coastal tribes. We're calling them the Black Forest tribes here, holding out in Vornhallen, potentially some Druidine over here. We've got these who are described as a fairly numerous but barbarous fisher folk along the mouths of the Gwathlo and down to the mouths of the Eisen. These are represented in the mod by the faction we're calling the Black Forest tribes. And these people may have been hostile, but we hear of no conflicts between them and Arnor at all. They seem to have just hung out on the coastlands, done fishing, in the case of Vornhallen, just hung out in the woods. And so Cardolan had it pretty easy, you could say. They had trade partners to the sort of north and west, and to the south in Gondor for a lot of their history. For Arthedain, of course, they had Lindon to the west, and Lindon, the elves of Círdan helped them out at various points through their wars with Angmar. There were dwarves in the Blue Hills to some extent, although it's interesting that Arvedui, when he fled in 1974-1975, the Rack of Arthedain, fled to an abandoned dwarf mine, and he didn't see fit to try to find any of the other settlements in the Blue Mountains. So maybe the dwarven presence in the Blue Mountains was extremely limited, and that is sort of one piece of why we're not really representing a dwarven faction owning any of these lands, although they could be taken over by by a dwarven faction if they got over here. So Arthedain has this. Arthedain, I guess, theoretically has northern neighbors in the Lossoth, but these were no doubt of very little account. I guess it's interesting that Arvedui was able to converse at all with the Lossoth, right? That must suggest something. Tolkien doesn't say anything about their languages being difficult. He does represent the speech of the chieftain of the Lossoth a little bit in Appendix A, and that is somewhat similar to what we see of Gon Gon's speech, although it must be said that Gon Gon is much more presented as much more, I don't know, barbaric, primitive, right? In his speech, he has and let's say he's represented as having an imperfect mastery of the common speech that, Theoden uses when he speaks with him. The chieftain of the Lossoth seems to speak more clearly, more naturally, but he does have a few tics, a few verbal tics. He talks about the ship of the elves that come to rescue Arvedui and his men. The chieftain of the Lossoth calls this ship a sea monster, right? So he's presented as maybe someone who hasn't seen these large elven, sailing ships that are big enough to go on the sea. So there's a little bit that suggests that maybe he's not familiar with all the ways of the South, as we would expect, but nevertheless he seems to have a fairly decent grasp of common, or Arvedui is able to converse with him in his own language, which I'm not sure how realistic that is. Regardless, there is a presence of Lossoth to the far north of Arthedain, but we're never told of any hostility. In Rhudaur, however, what do you have? Yes, you've got Rivendell, but, we don't really... It's interesting. I never considered to what extent Rhudaur pre-fall communicated with Rivendell. I mean, it's right here, right? So you would think that the Dunedain of Rhudaur would be, going to meet Elrond every now and then. But we don't hear of it. We do hear of Rivendell being involved in the wars against Angmar, but it is after... it is most active after Rhudaur has fallen. And actually, another interesting point, and I don't have the books in front of me here, but I believe that we are told that Rivendell was under siege at some point in this period during which the Hillmen ruled Rhudaur, which again suggests that the Hillmen were capable of besieging elves, right? Fascinating stuff. The way it's expressed is very tentatively in the Chronicles. It says that it is believed, or it is said, that at this time Rivendell was under siege. And I think we have to suppose that, again, the Hillmen are responsible somehow, or involved at least very heavily with this siege of Rivendell. Now, no doubt the Witch King was pulling the strings and, maybe sending troops down and so on. But the Hillmen, the people of Rhudaur, were in a position to besiege Rivendell. So it's interesting that they did that, especially given the fear and dread with which most middlemen view the elves. This is something that we hear about with regard to these forest dwellers of Aaron Vorn. These men dwell here in terror of the elves. I can't remember where it's mentioned that they are afraid of the elves, but they mostly hide out here south of the Branduin. They see this as sort of like a borderline between the uncanny land of the elves and the sort of good forests that they can feel safe in. So these are a kind of indigenous population of Middle-earth, terrified of the elves. We can also see that elven fear expressed at a much later date by the Rohirrim, right? We hear that Eomer talks about Lorien being perilous. He talks about the elves as being uncanny, being somewhat fearful, and Boromir talks about this too. And so we can see that even the men of Gondor have sort of absorbed this, what we might call a more middle-manish understanding of the Elven as this other, this thing that is to be avoided because it can trap you, because it can seduce you, it can take you away from the fields we know, to use Lord Dunsany's phrase. So at any rate, these Hillmen seem not to have been as terrified as those other groups of the elves. Here, in fact, is a stronghold that Sauron could not take during his war with the elves in the Second Age. This is the place, the stronghold, the refuge, that was able to hold out against him. This did not daunt the Hillmen of Rhudaur, I would like to suggest. And even if they were impelled by the Witch King, the fact that they undertook the operation at all, or the supposition that they undertook the operation at all, because I am stretching a little bit here, is I think a really tantalizing, fascinating one to show just how hardcore these Hillmen of Rhudaur must have been. And if that's the case, think how hard the Dunedain of Rhudaur must have had it in the days when they were trying to establish themselves. When the Dunedain of Arnor, when the land was won, were establishing their borders out here, they must have fought with the Hillmen, right? I mean, this would be the people that they would have had to unseat to take over the land. But they remained. The Hillmen remained. And in the mod, they remain as well. So despite the fact that after 1409, we hear nothing of Hillmen ever again, we hear about men. We hear about the evil men of Angmar, and these are the men who are associated with the towers and the ruined castles on the hills that Frodo and company see in the Fellowship of the Ring, that Bilbo sees in The Hobbit when he's journeying to Rivendell, this land of the Etten Moors, which is sort of strewn with the rubble of the ancient civilization of Rhudaur and Angmar. The ruins were not built by the Hillmen. The evil men of Angmar had a sort of a longer shadow over this land. But nevertheless, we are saying in this mod that some Hillmen must have survived. And I think that's a reasonable supposition. There's a tendency to view all of Rhudaur as entirely empty. Tolkien, of course, played into that as well. It suits his purposes, in the narrative sense. But for there to be a population at all, there must have been some, right? There must have been some people. So if you're playing as Angmar, you can get some Hillmen. So think about that when you start up your Angmar campaigns. Think if you can bring the glories of Hillmen culture back to their height in the middle parts of the 14th century, the Third Age. So anyway, just some more speculation there. We're continuing to work on the mod. We're going to keep plugging away at it. When I have stuff to show you, I'll show you. When we have other news, I'll give it. Otherwise, take care until the next one.